Now for Penn State, this matchup against Oregon is a lot similar to the one against Ohio State. And if that's the case,
you are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
and as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. My name is Zach Seyko. I am your host of the show. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can keep the action going with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place just a $5 bet, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Big Ten Championship, preview, and predictions. Be a part of the conversation. Let me know your score prediction, your final score prediction, key matchups, key players down in the comments section. For anybody that's new here, I give you my prediction first, and then I back it up with my reasoning, why I think the result is going to happen the way it will happen. And I think the Ducks are going to win this game. I think Oregon is going to win 31-24 against Penn State here. I know. The Penn State podcast host is picking against the Nittany Lions, so it's a similar matchup to Ohio State. And when I look at Oregon's pass catchers, the three dynamic wide receivers, Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Trayshawn Holden, against Penn State's defensive backs. And then you have to factor in that the difference between Oregon and Ohio State is Oregon actually has a very reliable tight end in Terrence Ferguson. So now you add the fact that Oregon has the veteran QB in Dillon Gabriel. It is tough to confuse him. You will not be able to fool him with defensive scheme. He is going to adjust. He's seen it all. He's been in college football for 6 years. So now you have someone that's efficient at the quarterback position with Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Trayshawn Holden, and Terrence Ferguson, all of which can win one-on-one matchups. Because who do you double? Okay, if you're Penn State, if you try to double Tez Johnson, then you leave a one-on-one matchup with any of Holden, Stewart, and it's not that A.J. Harris or Jalen Kimber or Cam Miller can't cover those guys, but who is winning those 50? Who is winning that matchup 50% of the time? I'm going to say, and then Terrence Ferguson at tight end. Do you use Jalen Reed to try to cover him in the box? Do you trust Tony Rojas, a second-year player, to cover a veteran like Terrence Ferguson, who just set the Oregon tight ends receiving touchdowns record, right? So these are mismatches, and then if you try to double one, you're going to leave everybody else on an island. So for Penn State, it's a pick your poison type of situation. And we saw that down the stretch in crunch time when Ohio State needed a play, when they needed a guaranteed first down or they needed to pick up a chunk of yards. Jeremiah Smith was getting open in one-on-one. Emeka Egbuka was doing the same thing. Or you could just go to Carnell Tate if you needed to. It's kind of the same thing. Oregon has too many options within the offense. So Tom Allen and the secondary are going to have to get creative to try to take them away. But Penn State, it's, again, one-score game. Penn State, so I talk about the plethora of talented players that Oregon has. They have a bunch of different players that can make an impact. It's the fact that so much talent for Penn State is condensed into two separate superstars. So Penn State might have the advantage here with the fact that they have the superstar players that are at the top if you rank them all. Abdul Carter and Tyler Warren are who I'm obviously referring to here. So you have the best playmaker on defense and the best overall playmaker on offense in the entire game. And that's a benefit for Penn State. So it's not like it's just one-sided here. You have an even impact on both sides of the football of game-changing type of players who are going to be future first-round picks. Abdul Carter could very well go in the top 10 of next year's NFL draft. Tyler Warren, definitely a first-round pick the way that he has performed. And you have to do so much. You have to sell out resources because good luck, even with Conerly Jr. at the left tackle spot. You're going to have to chip Abdul Carter. You're going to have to do things to scheme away from him. Same thing with Tyler Warren. I fully expect Oregon to bracket him. Oregon's going to have to bracket him. I want to talk about another matchup because this is why football coaches say games are won and lost in the trenches. This goes both ways. Oregon's defensive line versus Penn State's offensive line, and Penn State's defensive line against Oregon's defensive line. Oregon's defensive line just had 10 sacks. 10 sacks against Washington. Now, that's not going to happen against Penn State. We know that Washington's offensive line is not the greatest. We've seen that from Penn State's perspective. But Oregon certainly has an advantage here. And I point to that battle against Nolan Rucci. Nolan Rucci is a player that's going to be circled here with the most responsibility. And if you're Penn State, Do you help Chip with your best playmaker, Tyler Warren? Do you leave him in to lay a block and take him off of his route for a couple of seconds? Or what about Singleton and Allen when they could be used in the passing game? Do you use them to help block and double team whichever defensive end? Oregon can rotate any player that they want to. Is that Mateo Uiagalelei? Is that Tatum Tuioti? What about Jordan Birch, who's just returned from injury, but he has the stats, the best stats out of any of those pass rushers, and he hasn't even played a full season. So Penn State really has its work cut out for them, and Drew Shelton has been good in pass protection, but still at times can lose those 50-50 battles. So Penn State and Drew Aller is going to have potentially a lot of pressure if they're not careful. So Penn State's offensive line is going to have its work cut out for them on the boundaries. But then what about the interior? I didn't even name the best players on Oregon's defensive line. Jeremy Caldwell and Derek Harmon. Dynamic duo at defensive tackle. They ruin games. And Penn State's interior of the offensive line, Nick Dawkins, Sal Wormley, and Vanga Ioane are going to have their work cut out for them. But those two players can make the three opposing offensive linemen in the interior. That's still a mismatch. Somehow 2 is greater than 3 in this case. But let's flip it over to Penn State's defensive line. Like I said, this is where the game is won and lost, truly in the trenches. Oregon's offensive line hasn't been the best on the interior. If there's a weakness, and there's not, these are all strengths for Oregon. That's another thing about Oregon. Oregon doesn't have any weaknesses. They just have lesser strengths, if you will. So when I look at Zane Durant against Oregon's interior of the offensive line, that is going to be a huge game changer for it. They've had injuries at that guard spot, and Oregon's still gotten reliable play out of whoever's at either guard spot, reliable enough. But now you're going up against probably a motivated Zane Durant who was snubbed from the All Big Ten team. Oh, he was an honorable mention. Sorry, everyone. He was an honorable mention. Should have been first team. Should have been first team, no lower than second team. But whatever. It's more motivation, more fuel to the fire for Zane Durant. So going up against those guards who are not as much of a strength for Oregon, that's a matchup to watch for, and Devon J. Thomas as well. But this is where I'll talk about Alonzo Ford in a second, losing his impact, because health is going to matter in this game. Deni Dennis Sutton, speaking of health, is getting back to 100% and should be 100% or as close to it for this game. Going up against Cornelius, the right tackle of Oregon. Like I said, reliable. There's not necessarily a weakness, but in games where Oregon had it close, Cornelius did not have his best game. Oregon's offensive line did not have its best game. So that's why I look to the superstar that I mentioned, Abdul Carter, Deni Dennis Sutton on that other side, because if you're going to double Abdul Carter and try to scheme away from him, good luck with Deni Dennis Sutton in one-on-one, and the same thing with Zane Durant up the middle. Dillon Gabriel is a mobile quarterback, but he's not a speedy quarterback. He is not a true dual threat. He can move if he needs to. So Penn State's defensive line and Oregon's defensive line, whomever has the better day, could be the difference maker. That could be the difference in an Oregon win versus a Penn State win. Let's talk about another factor here. Penn State's wide receivers are a liability. So we talk about how Oregon's wide receivers are one of its biggest strengths. Penn State's wide receivers to this point are the team's biggest weaknesses. And then add injury to insult, honestly, because Trey Wallace might not be available in this game. Penn State's number one clear-cut wide receiver, and that's why I compare it to the Ohio State matchup. Oregon's secondary isn't necessarily elite, but they're better than what Penn State has to offer at wide receiver. And if Penn State's wide receivers cannot win its one-on-one battles, the defense can just play press coverage, take them away. Then Oregon can devote double the resources to Tyler Warren. Then they can blitz, because we've seen that no matter who the offensive coordinator is, if you're facing an elite defense, which Penn State is right here, Ohio State, Michigan and Ohio State from 2023, it is all the same, where the wide receivers need to step up in some sort of way to get the defense to at least respect that part of the passing game. But then they can sell out for the run. They can pressure Drew Aller. So the wide receivers are really an X factor here. If they can just give Penn State something, They can give Penn State something. It allows more balance and it allows more creativity on Andy Kotelnicki's part offensively and can confuse Oregon's defense. Now, where is Oregon different? They're not a mirror image of Ohio State. But why is this team number one? Oregon's team speed. They're a fast team. Drew Aller even pointed it out in his Zoom press conference. But it's the combination of speed and their physicality. This is not a Pac-12, simply a talented Pac-12 holdover. They are not here by accident. It is because they have built themselves for Big Ten competition. They can win the shootout, they can use their speed, or they can be physical with you. They can win a rock fight. And that's why elite teams are elite. That's why great teams are great, because they can win in a variety of ways. But in the Big Ten, you have to win a specific way. You can't just be all finesse. And I think that's what USC, UCLA, and Washington struggled with, is they were too much finesse and not enough physicality. Oregon is not like that. Oregon has built itself for the Big Ten, and Oregon is healthier than Penn State. That's why I mentioned Alonzo Ford in passing here, but Ford is a big deal not having him at defensive tackle. Anthony Donko, a starting right tackle, pointing out Nolan Rucci as a possible mismatch for Penn State for against Oregon's defensive line. Those things matter. And I know KJ Winston has been out most of the season, but it would be nice to have another superstar playmaker for Penn State to go along with Tyler Warren and Abdul Carter. This game's going to be close, 31-24. As I mentioned, it's a one-score game, but I think Oregon wins here. Again, let me know your thoughts down in the comments section, your final score prediction. Now, how is Penn State affected if they lose this game? How will the College Football Committee look at it? I'll tell you more, plus some keys to victory for both sides on the other side of this break. And today's episode is brought to you by Better Together. Hate the team you drafted in season-long fantasy, but you want to stay in the action? Let's introduce Better Together, the first cooperative daily fantasy sports platform where teamwork triumphs talent and you can win with your friends, not against them. You pick more or less on real-time player stats, strategize with your partner to boost your odds, and climb the leaderboard together. So grab a friend, join the social daily fantasy movement at Better Together. Better Together is the first cooperative daily sports fantasy application. Provides a sense of camaraderie and enhances the social experience of watching sports. It also makes you realize that DFS is fun alone, but like other things, it's better with friends. And it's a way to stay connected with those friends. When you can't watch sports together in person from time to time, it puts your group chat to the test and lets you prove if yours is the best. Download Better Together now from the App Store and sign up using promo code LOCKEDON for a chance to play in a contest. Because winning alone is fun, but it's better together. That's Better Together now in the App Store. Sign up using promo code LOCKEDON. Now, what happens if Penn State loses this game? And that's kind of what I'm expecting here with my final score prediction. I think Oregon, I'm going to give some overall thoughts here. I do think Oregon will be leading at half. We know that Penn State is a second half team, and that's where they will make a push. But I think the Ducks will be able to manage it late down the stretch, also because Penn State's ground game has not been the best. It's been a little bit of a liability down the stretch. Now, I'll talk about some more keys to victory here. But this is a good measuring stick to see how deep Penn State can get into a postseason run, how deep they can make it into the playoffs. Because outside of Ohio State, I'm not afraid to admit that Penn State hasn't played the most elite teams here, but at the same time, they still played a pretty deep schedule with 10 Power 4 opponents, and they lost to Ohio State by 7. But this challenge against Oregon certainly tells us, okay, how great is Penn State? Are they poised for a deep postseason run? Now, will the College Football Playoff Committee penalize Penn State with a loss? Depending on how you look at it. So I posed this question on X, formerly known as Twitter, and for Penn State, are they going to be penalized by the committee? It's very much a possibility. Now, the language is delicate, saying that, well, the committee said that they're not going to adjust their thinking, if you will, right? This is just a basic version of what they said. But they're trying to imply that they're not going to just tank a team for losing a playoff game or the Big Ten championship or any of these other championship games. I don't know that they're looking at it that way, though, because if Penn State ends up losing this game, they're going to fall. They now have the same number of losses as Ohio State again, with 2, and Ohio State beat them head to head, for example. Notre Dame would just have the 1 loss. And then hypothetically speaking, I don't expect Texas to beat Georgia in the second round between them. Texas has been ranked higher than Penn State all season. How could you put Penn State ahead of Texas? Penn State would be ranked either number 1 or number 2 with a win over Oregon, which would be great. You get that bye into the quarterfinal. But I worry about Penn State falling to the number 7 or 8 seed. I think they're guaranteed a home playoff game at this point, but it might not be the 5th or the 6th seed. It very well could be the 7th or even the 8th seed, depending on how Penn State is viewed by the committee against the likes of Notre Dame, against the likes of now Ohio State, which Penn State did lose to, and that other common opponent, hypothetically both losing to Oregon in that sense, and then Notre Dame with the 1 loss. And everybody's been calling for Notre Dame to be ranked above Penn State. Maybe this is just enough reasoning for the committee to do that. Sometimes it's better to be watching from the couch, right? If you're Notre Dame's case. Let's get back to this Penn State versus Oregon matchup. Keys to victory for Penn State. I mentioned it. The ground game has not been at its best. Katron Allen has not had a good slate of games, at least most recently. Now, Nicholas Singleton is getting back to 100%, but you need to get the ground game going. You have to get the ground game going because it's going to allow Penn State, Andy Kotelnicki, to be more creative. It's going to allow the passing game to be opened up. Nicholas Singleton being as close to 100% as possible here is huge and a key for overall the ground game going. And that involves the offensive line too, but it's not going to be easy. It is easier said than done in this case because I mentioned everybody along Oregon's defensive line and how they can impact this game. But I will say that Oregon's pass rush is better than its run defense. So there is that. But Penn State's Tyler Warren, Drew Aller connection. I can't say it's the overall passing game is better than its run game, if you can believe that. In terms of the overall effectiveness of through the air versus on the ground, Penn State's aerial attack is better when you look at the numbers. 9th in yards per attempt. 20, I think top 25 if you're yards per carry for Penn State's offense. Another key, Tyler Warren needs to have a hero game 2.0. Maybe not necessarily to the extent of 17 receptions, 224 yards, but he needs to have, I think, at least 100 yards in this game. Is Oregon going to be able to scheme him away? Because no team has figured that out except to an extent of Ohio State, but even still, Warren had a significant impact in that game. So Oregon won't be able to take him away, but how can you limit him? That's a key there for Penn State to make sure that he has a hero type of game with what I've mentioned about the wide receivers in the ground game. Scheme away from those mismatches. This is a similar key that I had against Ohio State. See if you can get the wide receivers open. What can you do? Can you get creative? Do you mix both quarterbacks in? Do you get Bo Pribula involved in the game plan? You got to do stuff that's unorthodox and get creative to manufacture some yards and manufacture some points if you're Penn State. Defensively, Tom Allen is going to have to run zone. I don't know that I trust Penn State in man-to-man coverage against the likes of Johnson, Holden, and Stewart all simultaneously, in addition to Terrence Ferguson and maybe Jordan James out of the backfield as well. That's 5 options for Dillon Gabriel to go to. You got to maybe try some exotic blitzes, but I don't know that you can necessarily confuse Gabriel, veteran of the game. So you can't just double one player because you're going to pay for it. So that's why you have to run zone and try your best to disguise it if you can. Find a way to maximize Abdul Carter. Line him up everywhere. Defensive end over the center, and Penn State's been doing that, but maybe do it a little more frequently here. Don't just wait for obvious pass rushing situations. See if you can get creative and line him up all over the place. Do some more stunts. Get creative with Abdul Carter. Force turnovers. So Oregon doesn't commit a lot of turnovers here, but Gabriel has had costly turnovers. I think 4 interceptions inside of the red zone. And that's bad. And that can swing the momentum of the game if Penn State gets a defensive stand in the red zone. So forced turnovers, but timely turnovers, more importantly, which Penn State hasn't been great at this season, but James Franklin has been emphasizing it down the stretch. Let's look at Oregon's keys to victory here. Oregon's keys to victory: exploit the mismatches in Penn State's secondary. See if you can get a one-on-one matchup with a future NFL starter in Tez Johnson versus, I still need to see more from Cam Miller. That is a mismatch, Johnson versus Miller. Get the ball out quickly. Be efficient. Dillon Gabriel, go through your reads, but you're not going to have time to sit back there and read a book. Penn State can get organic pressure with Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant, Devon J. Thomas, and Abdul Carter. Those four, so Penn State can devote extra resources potentially. So if Oregon gets a little creative here in the passing game, then Penn State might have to dial up some blitzes in that case. One of Penn State's biggest issues all season long has been missed tackling. If you can get the extra yards, every yard counts in this case. Take advantage of the missed tackling if you're Oregon. Defensively, sell out for the run, bracket Tyler Warren, kind of similar. If you want to get pressure on Drew Aller, attack Nolan Rucci. Blitz that side, and that's Drew Aller's non-dominant side. He's going to have to roll to his left. Rucci's the right tackle, so he's going to have to roll away from the pressure to his non-throwing side. Drew Aller has been effective on the run, but like I said, Oregon's pass rush is significantly better than, other than Ohio State, than anybody else Penn State has faced when it came to the opposing defensive line. We'll talk some more about key matchups that I haven't pointed out already. Plus, how is Penn State's offense going to be schematically run? Same thing with Oregon's setup. And we'll talk about game info that you need to know, including injuries. I'll tell you more on the other side of this break. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet just $5. $5 and you'll get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get that hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more. And it's on the same page where you place your bets. It's that convenient. It's that simple. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. And if we look over at FanDuel.com, we can see the lines for the Big Ten Championship. Penn State versus Oregon. Oregon is a 3.5-point favorite. Penn State, 3.5-point underdogs. Minus 170 on the money line for the Ducks, plus 140 for Penn State. The total has settled at 49.5. It opened at 50.5. If you like any of those lines, you can bet them over at FanDuel.com. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. And remember, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Again, that is FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. I'll start with Penn State's defense here. They're going to continue to run a 4-2-5, and they've had three linebackers in there at times, depending on the opponent here. But since Oregon runs a lot of 3 receiver sets, could potentially run 4 receivers. It's a spread look for Oregon's offense. So Penn State's going to continue to run the 4-2-5. I haven't mentioned Zach Wheatley and Jalen Reed to this point. And Jalen Reed is starting to teeter into the superstar conversation. Really, honestly, he was snubbed from not being a first team all Big Ten safety. And Jalen Reed has done it all. He's forced turnovers, interceptions, lead one of the leaders in tackles on the team. So Jalen Reed does it all, and he will be an X factor here. So that's why, where can Penn State get creative? Maybe hide him in the defensive scheme, to drop him in zone, maybe have him as an extra man against Terrence Ferguson, maybe send him on some blitzes, right? You can get creative with Jalen Reed, and that's why Penn State's defense had to be almost changed up, not entirely, but had to go some significant rebuilds when KJ Winston was he's been lost for the season. Not an official, it's a long-term injury, not officially technically out for the season, but a long-term injury kind of speaks for itself at this point. But Jalen Reed's role has been this hybrid where he's had to move back to a traditional safety role rather than being someone around the line of scrimmage, but he's still doing that. Can he do that more against Oregon's offense? So Oregon's going to be spread. They don't go under center. They're going to have multiple wide receivers at all times. So Penn State's going to have more defensive backs on the field, but they've been built that way anyway with the 4-2-5. On offense, Penn State can do a bunch of different things schematically. They can go under center if they want to, but they primarily operate out of shotgun. They'll do a lot of pre-snap movement. For Oregon fans, Oregon spectators that have not watched a lot of Penn State football this season, maybe you were scouting ahead at the what if they play Penn State, right? But you'll see that Andy Kotelnicki is known for his motions, his pre-snap movement, and it does not disappoint. He will do a lot of that. Guys will move all over the place. You'll see the guard, Vanga Ioane, who is the biggest guy on the team at 360 pounds, as a slot receiver. Get ready for that because that is going to be called multiple times here. But that's what you need to know about Penn State's offense is that they operate primarily out of shotgun. They'll run 2 wide receiver, 2 tight end sets. We'll see if they use Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen together more rather than exclusively. That injury to Cam Wallace, the 3rd string running back, really changed how they used Allen and Singleton. And frankly, Singleton's injury as well. He hasn't been 100% all season. My point being is that Penn State can get creative, and it's so unorthodox because you don't know what to expect next. Penn State's offense is far from vanilla. Let's talk about some game info here and then finish up with injuries. Just injured players of note, guys who are either going to be out or questionable for both Penn State and Oregon. So if you did not know it already, this game is going to be played Saturday, December 7th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Kickoff is at 8 p.m. Eastern Time kickoff, and it is broadcasted on CBS. It is at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis, Indiana, home of the Indianapolis Colts of the NFL. As we already made it clear, Oregon is a 3.5-point favorite. Penn State is plus 140 on the money line. Total set at 49.5. This is an indoor stadium, so there's a roof. That means no impact of a weather, which is why part of the reason why I do like more points in this game with that 31-24 final. In the series, lifetime, Penn State is 3-1 against the Ducks. 1995, most recently, that 38-20 Rose Bowl victory where Kajana Carter went off in that game. Then they hadn't played for 31 more years. So Penn State and Oregon go through these long gaps where they don't play each other for 30 years. That last matchup was 1964, where in University Park, Penn State's home field, they lost to Oregon 22-14 back in 64. Penn State historically is 1-0 in Big Ten title games, in Big Ten championship games. Not for the conference title, but when the conference championship game was actually introduced, Penn State's only been to 1. And for most people that do remember, 2016 comeback victory, 38-31 over the Wisconsin Badgers. And it felt like Penn State had finally returned to that status of a true contender and maybe should have made the college football playoff that year in 2016. They certainly had the resume to back it up. Oregon, this is obviously their first Big Ten title game since they've never been a member of the Big Ten championship. We'll start with Penn State's injury list, which is longer than Oregon's injury list in terms of notable players. I've already mentioned Alonzo Ford, Anthony Donko, KJ Winston. They are out for this game. Another player talking about how Penn State's defensive backs are going to have their hands full with Oregon's receivers. Elliott Washington may or may not be available. He's been questioned but ruled out recently. So the likelihood of him playing is not likely, frankly. Trey Wallace is another questionable player for Penn State's wide receivers to keep an eye on. Caden Saunders as well. Does Penn State get both of them back? Or are they going to be missing both? Guys who are... We expect to be out for the season. Tight end Andrew Rapplier, defensive end Zariah Fisher, running back Cam Wallace, linebacker Keon Wiley. Does Penn State, is he ready? He's been practicing. Is he going to be available for this game? Penn State can just use any and all players at any position at this point in time. Looking at Oregon's injured players of note, Tez Johnson and Jordan Birch, just keep an eye on them because they were brought back for that game against Washington, but they had been out leading up to that point in time. Marcus Harper, Matthew Bedford is someone that's shown up on the injury report with some questionable play, I should say, from the interior of Oregon's offensive line. When Bedford at the beginning of the season was expected to be a starter, but now there's been a little bit of a rotation at that right guard spot. Marcus Harper as well. Maybe Bedford ends up playing in this game for Oregon. We shall see. Another defensive back, Jaleel Florence for Oregon, and 2 guys on the defensive line, Mike Heel Gardner and Keon Ware Hudson, are guys that are going to be questionable for this game. But some depth rotational pieces for Oregon. Those are those first 4 players that are named are difference makers for the Ducks. That's going to do it here for this edition of Locked On Nittany Lions, the Big Ten Championship preview, Penn State versus Oregon. It will be an exciting game. It's going to be a close game. It is not going to be a blowout, and Penn State can win this game despite me expecting Oregon to win. 31-24 is my final score prediction. What is yours? Let me know down in the comments section. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. I'd really appreciate it if you left a like on this show. Share it with friends and family. If you're not already, become an everyday or subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts for the latest conversations around your favorite Penn State sports teams.